I think on a much more serious note, we're prepared today to draw on a wealth of talent. Our first panel will be led by Annie Anton, who's one of my colleagues on the faculty at Georgia Tech. She and I actually became chairs of schools at the same time. She was formerly the chair of the School of Interactive Computing within the college, and she has been involved in government relationships of various kinds. Most recently, I think, the Bipartisan Commission on Enhancing Cybersecurity for the Nation, and is also now the Associate Director of Privacy Engineering within the Institute for Information Security and Privacy here. So I will allow Annie to come and introduce the panel, and we can get started.
Good morning. Can everyone hear me? Excellent. I'm going to ask the panelists to please come on stage and take a seat wherever you feel most comfortable. Show us your best side. So as Joe mentioned, and the Senator as well, today we're going to be talking about the elephant in the room. And so I just wanted to start off by saying in the offline world, we our individuals, businesses, et cetera, we are protected by the police locally. We're protected at the national level by our military, who, among other important jobs, also protect our nation against attack. But in cyberspace, it's quite different. In cyberspace, we all live in a bad neighborhood, and we live only milliseconds away from an attack from a foreign nation. And the police and the military can't stop all of those attacks. And sometimes companies can feel on their own, having to match their own corporate resources against the resources and expertise of a nation state by themselves. So to address these issues, we have the people who have been at the top of the most important agencies and companies for detecting and responding to cyber attacks in the U.S. and it's from the U.S. to the U.S. and its allies. So let's turn to them, because they are the experts, and I encourage you to read their bios. They're amazing individuals. And I will just focus on a couple of things about each of them. We have Michelle Florin. We're going to start here closest to me, is Michael Morrell. Michael is an advisor and an author. He was he's chairman of the National Security Task Force in the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And he is the former acting director and deputy director of the Central Intelligence Agency. Michelle Flournoy is co-founder and managing partner of Westech Advisors, and she's the former Undersecretary of Defense Policy for the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Department of Defense. Nilo Razi-Howe is a technology investor, an executive, and an entrepreneur, and she is the former Chief Strategy Officer and Senior Vice President of Strategy and Operations for RSA. And finally, Rick Leggett is an advisor and fellow and trustee, and he's the former deputy director of the National Security Agency. And so I think I'll just start initially by asking each of you to explain to the audience your role in your former agencies or company, and how your agency led or helped lead the response to nation-state attacks for cybersecurity. Michael, I'm going to start with you.
So it's great to be here. Good morning. I do feel the need to defend Director Deutsch. But in the last 3 minutes, I haven't figured out how to do that. So I'm going to pass on that. So CIA really has two roles with regard to cybersecurity. One is to defend our own networks. And you won't be surprised that we take that extraordinarily seriously, since we know what the cutting-edge nation-state capabilities are. We don't assume that it's not possible to jump from an unclassified system to a top-secret system. So much so that we keep our most sensitive product on paper. We don't even digitize it. So we've gone back to the old days in securing some of our most sensitive data, interestingly. So part of the job is to protect ourselves. The other part of the job, and the much more important part, is we along with the National Security Agency, and Rick will talk about this, is that we are responsible for understanding the plans, the intentions, and the capabilities of our adversaries in this space. So whether they're nation states or whether they're private entities, organized crime groups, hacktivists, whatever you might want to call them, what are their technical capabilities? What are they capable of doing? How are those evolving? And what are their plans? What do they want to do to us? And what are their intentions? And I would say both tactically and strategically. So tactically, what are they doing and what do they want to do? And strategically, what are their answers to the questions that Senator Nunn posed? Right? Because those strategic questions apply not only to us, but they apply to the Chinese and to the Russians and the Iranians and the North Koreans. So those are the two fundamental jobs. And I'll be very honest with you. I think we did a much better job at the first part, defending ourselves, than we did at the more important part, which is understanding the adversary. I thought we did that fairly well from a tactical perspective. I didn't think we did that very well from a strategic perspective, and maybe we can come back and talk about that.
Thank you. Michelle?
So thank you all for being here. It's great to be back here, and especially to help honor my longtime mentor and friend, Senator Nunn. Thank you for your leadership on this. So in the Department of Defense, historically, the department has had several missions in cyberspace. The first, it was to defend and protect the .mil environment, and that means everything from an email on a desktop in DoD all the way up to nuclear command and control. So a very wide and complicated and challenging mission, given the sophistication of the state threats that we're facing. In addition, because DoD also encompasses some intelligence agencies like the NSA, like DIA, there's also an intelligence function that's undertaken by DoD. I'll leave most of that to Rick. And there is also what we call preparation of the battlefield, meaning the kind of surveillance and analysis and preparatory steps that are necessary to be able to create real cyber options for a decision maker in the future. Whether that's tactical options in support of Cybercom's mission, which includes using cyber operations in support of larger military operations, or whether it's more strategic options, cyber options to present to a commander-in-chief, a president, in the event that that's needed. What I just wanted to note, that's kind of the traditional set of missions. The new DoD strategy, cyber strategy, which was just released, modifies that in two respects. One, it directs the department to defend forward, which means actually be prepared to, and in some cases conduct, offensive cyber operations to prevent, disrupt, defeat at the source state-sponsored attacks. That is new, and I think that's worthy of discussion. The second is it broadens DoD's defensive and protective mission beyond .mil to also, when required or when directed, to be prepared to also help defend DoD critical infrastructure that's key to DoD missions, like power projection. So imagine the electrical grid, the transportation grid that will enable U.S. forces to move to a crisis overseas. And similarly, to help protect what's called the DIB, the Defense Industrial Base. So think of all the supply chain that supports the military. Those, again, that expansion is new, and I think worthy of discussion.
I'm going to ask Rick to speak first, because then I want to get the industry perspective from Nilo.
Sure, happy to. Thanks, Peter. Thank you for the invitation. And Senator and Bank of America folks, thanks for hosting this venue, sponsoring it. So National Security Agency is part of the Department of Defense. It's got two bosses, basically, the Secretary of Defense and the Director of National Intelligence. And so in the DoD role, it's what's called the Combat Support Agency, and its job is to support the department and the combatant commands of the department in their mission. And in the intelligence community is to produce foreign intelligence in support of policymakers and other folks in the U.S. government. What NSA does in cybersecurity is basically three things. The first is signals intelligence, a specific kind of intelligence that involves exploiting communication systems and networks in order to produce foreign intelligence about things of interest to the United States. And unfortunately, way too many people know way too much about that, thanks to some disclosures back in 2013 that you may have heard of. Made life a lot more difficult in many ways. But that's the mission, the core mission, which is to produce that foreign intelligence by pulling apart those communication systems and networks. Second, and produce that intelligence specifically in regards to cybersecurity on foreign plans and intentions and capabilities and operations, as Michael said earlier. And so the second mission is information assurance, which is actually a responsibility that's given to the Secretary of Defense, and NSA is the executive agent for that. And that is to protect what are called national security systems. That means classified systems and some specific unclassified systems like the .mil domain, where NSA has a role in that, and does things like work with the National Institute of Standards and Technologies with things like creating secure cryptographic algorithms, that sort of thing. Those two missions together occur on the global telecommunications infrastructure, which is the most complex system that's ever been designed by man. And design is loosely applied because it hasn't actually so much been designed as cobbled together over the last several decades with a series of interfaces that are put together primarily with a design to assure availability of communications and reliability of communications, and not so much with security. But so to exploit that and to protect that requires a real deep knowledge of how those systems operate, and sometimes in ways that the people who designed them and built them and deploy them and operate them actually don't understand. And NSA does that as part of its mission, and so that leads to our third role in cybersecurity, which is to provide detailed and expert technical advice to folks like Andy's former folks in the Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, the CIA, other parts of the non-DoD parts of the U.S. government that have that mission.
Thank you. Neela, you've been the top strategy officer at RSA Security. So what is the role of your company or the private sector in general? And what is the role that we play in actually responding to nation state attacks?
So first of all, thank you. And I think like everyone here, any excuse to leave DC these days is very welcome. So please invite me anytime to come down here. One slide aside, by the way. Cyberspace actually was defined in 1984 by William Gibson in his book Neuromancer. And I think that definition is pretty prescient for anyone who's read the book. He defined it as a consensual hallucination experienced simultaneously by billions of legitimate operators. And so I think perhaps Director Deutsch didn't want to refer to that, but it feels pretty accurate these days to refer to cyberspace as a consensual hallucination. So at RSA, the security function actually reported to me, and of all the things that were on my plate, including predicting the future, figuring out how to dominate the market as one of the largest cybersecurity companies, the one thing that kept me up at night was the security function and owning that piece of it. And there were a couple of elements there. First of all, we have to make sure that we have the right security architecture, the right people, processes, technologies in place to defend ourselves and defend our networks, and make sure that we have the right response plans if and when something happened. Second piece of it, because our products are used by the financial services industry, no one's ever asked me to talk louder. Because we service the financial services industry, we were subject to regulatory compliance, so the security function also owned the compliance role, PCI compliance, et cetera. And the final piece of it was to ensure that our security products our products which serves the cybersecurity market were secure by design. And while the engineering teams actually owned that process, we were the check and balance with respect to those products. And not only were we the check and balance, but if a flaw was discovered, and I like to say the human operating system is fundamentally flawed, Is this still not working?
Turn the switch back on.
There we go. Is it working now? Okay, so I think it's working now.
Human operating system.
Right, the human operating system. Thank you. Because the human operating system has fundamental flaws in it, we don't code perfectly. Products are bound to have flaws in architecture and design, as one of the questioners sort of pointed out. So when those flaws are discovered, the security team led the process of responding, figuring out the appropriate disclosures, et cetera. So it's a pretty robust activity that you engage in, and it doesn't matter where the threat comes from. Your job is to protect against that threat, whether it's nation state or not. Now, what I will say, and here I would respectfully disagree with the great Andy Osment, shockingly, but when you look at the types of activities that go on out there, we are responsible for making sure that our companies are resilient and can survive. And that's 100% our responsibility. So that comes with our products or services, our own infrastructure. When there's criminal activity, there's a shared responsibility, as there is in any sort of criminal activity. The victim and law enforcement come together in partnership to figure out what happened and to prosecute the criminals. When it comes to nation-state attacks, I would humbly state that's not our responsibility. You know, and just to put a crazy example out there, if Mexico invaded San Diego and took over Qualcomm's headquarters, I don't think the conversation would be, hey, what could Qualcomm have done differently? How could they have protected themselves? What regulation can we impose to make sure next time a state invades, a country invades, they can protect themselves? In the private sector, we don't have the ability to deter, frankly, to defend ourselves, to respond appropriately to nation-state attacks. We do not have escalation dominance. It's not legal for us to do that. So when it comes to nation-state attacks, I know it's very difficult. I know there's a lot going on. But the government needs to organize in order to protect the private sector from nation-state attacks. And there's a lot of work to do without question. There is mission authority capability mismatch. The function is dispersed throughout the federal government. It's a very complicated situation. But I don't think that's an excuse to opt out and say, it's too hard. We're going to pick what we defend against. And by the way, private sector, you're on your own for the rest of it. I think it's one of the most critical dangers we face. So my response, wearing my private sector hat today, is that really has to be the country's responsibility. And we need to come together and figure out how to organize to respond appropriately to the activities that are going on today.
So thank you very much to each of you. Michelle, you mentioned the new cyber strategy, and Nilo, you just mentioned that you feel that we need a better national strategy for defending against nation-state attacks. And so I'll ask you each to comment on what do you recommend as a coordinated strategy for the U.S. to respond, and how should it be structured? Michelle.
I'll dive into that one. I think that there are two critical, there are many elements, but let me cite two things that I think are important. The first is that we are in a deep deterrence hole. State sponsors of cyber attacks have come to believe that they can attack our core democratic processes, they can steal billions of dollars of intellectual property, they can sit on our critical infrastructure and be ready to do what they please, and we will do nothing. I think the first order of business is to try to reestablish some measure of deterrence in cyberspace. That requires real clarity in our declaratory policy about what we are willing to defend. Two, some alignment of those mission authorities' capabilities to develop real options for president. And that's not just cyber response, it's got to be a whole of government. It has to include diplomacy, sanctions, intelligence, all kinds of tools brought together. And third, we then have to demonstrate resolve. We actually have to show that when we, in the future, certain things, there will be a response. And we have to understand what different adversaries value most. what is going to deter Vladimir Putin is probably different than what may deter China or Iran or North Korea. So that's a very rich work agenda right there. The second piece is, as you mentioned, the authorities, the capabilities for cyber are widely distributed and not well coordinated or integrated across the US government. In the past, when we've had these kinds of situations, one of the things we've done, and I'm going to use an acronym for Senator Nunn, we formed a GATF, which is a Joint Interagency Task Force. We did this in the counter-drug area back in the 80s and 90s. We've now done it extremely successfully in parts of counterterrorism. I think as a starting point, we need to basically create an operational task force that is sharing intelligence, information, authorities, capabilities, and developing whole-of-government responses to this persistent set of penetrations and attacks that we're experiencing. So those are two things I'd put on the table as part of a strategy.
So as a follow-up, I'll ask if you may or may not have familiarity with the new NSPM. I think it's a National Security Presidential Memorandum. Is that correct? Yes. For offensive cybersecurity that was recently issued. And so I'll ask you, do you feel that takes a step in the right direction? Is there anything you can tell us about it for any of you?
So I think it is a step in the right direction. I actually, won't find this on my resume, but I was actually involved in the crafting of PPD 20 back in the 2011 or 12 timeframe. And that was a sort of a Frankenstein policy document that described how cyber operations were going to happen. And it was trying to make some very different constituencies within the executive branch happy. The folks who wanted to use cyber as a tool in order to impose our national will on adversaries, and folks who were concerned about the legal foundation and the precedents in other domains that applied there, and concern over what that would mean in terms of actual international law. And so we ended up with this thing that basically said if you want to change a comma on somebody else's website, the president needs to approve it, which is completely unworkable, and we've proven that over the intervening years. So this is a move to more agility. I think the thing that I would look for in this going forward is that there is that robust discussion about how we do this, but that we don't just have endless discussions. We come to a conclusion on we're going to do this in this responsible adult kind of a way.
Can I just jump in here and reinforce what Michelle said, because I think she's absolutely right. And I think that the world is becoming, in this respect of not having deterrence, is becoming more and more dangerous every day. Because when you don't deter somebody who attacks you, not only is that adversary going to continue to attack you, but other countries and other adversaries are going to learn that they can get away with it as well. So because we have not deterred Vladimir Putin from what he did in 2016, not only has he continued to do it, maybe not on the scale that he did it in 2016, but he's still doing it today. But now we see the Chinese doing it, not only in their neck of the woods in Taiwan, but we just had the DNI tell us that they're now doing it here in the United States of America. We've got the Turks doing it with its diaspora in Western Europe. And so people have learned that this weaponization of social media is something that is not only effective, but that they can get away with because they haven't been deterred. So we have to figure this out fast, because this idea that I can get away with it is spreading and spreading quickly.
And if I can add to that, is this mic working?
Yes.
To underscore that point, there were 17 other countries whose elections were influenced over the past couple of years. We're not in this alone. So whatever solution we come up with has to be a joint solution, not just the United States, but working closely with our allies and all the democracies that right now are under threat. The other thing I would say is because critical infrastructure, for the most part outside of national security systems, is owned by private sector, one of the biggest problems we have to solve is how we get information to the private sector. And a lot of people talk about overclassification. Right now, you need to have a security clearance to be brought in and understand what's actually going on out there, and it's causing all sorts of problems. So we need to figure out how to get the information real time to the folks who are tasked with defending the networks, because it's really, really hard to do. And we have to be right every single time. And when it comes to trying to defend against a nation-state actor, that's a very, very difficult thing to do. So solving how that private-public partnership from an information sharing perspective works to get that classified information to folks like Andy very fast is a very important part of this.
If I can elaborate on that a little bit, I think Milu's right in this case, and I think that the rise of commercial intelligence organizations, or organizations like the former iSight that's now part of FireEye, or Symantec, or CrowdStrike, or a host of other ones, that's good for us in the intelligence business, because what it provides is other people who often have the ability to talk about sources and methods in a way that the intelligence community does not, and can help with attribution. And some of those companies are very, very good in what they do. So
triangulating the information, right, between what the private companies are coming up with and the threats they see and what the government is seeing,
exactly,
becomes very powerful.
So we've been talking about deterrence, and so I'm going to ask you, given that attribution is actually difficult to do, or sometimes difficult to do, or to prove to a skeptical public, are there effective ways to deter nation-state adversaries from actually doing attacks?
I think Russia's managed to do that. They've got a great deterrence program. They have tools, and they're willing to use them, and everybody knows that. I can't think of another nation that has as good of a cyber deterrence.
You know, I think one of the things that we have to think carefully about here is what do you actually want to deter, and what don't you want to deter? So when the Chinese hacked OPM, my reaction was not, oh, the Chinese are bad. My reaction was, wow, good for them, bad for us. In this context, if somebody walked into my office when I was deputy director of CIA and said, boss, we can steal the security records of all Chinese national security officials, I would have said go for it, and I would not have had to ask anybody for permission. So I'm not sure we want to deter traditional espionage that's conducted via cyber. Because why? Because we do it too. So I think we got to be careful in deciding what we're going to deter and not deter. Should we deter economic espionage? I think so, because we don't do it. So I think we got to define at the beginning part of Michelle's construct of what do we do here to deter. We got to figure out what do we want to deter and what don't we want to deter.
If I could jump in on that, I think, and it goes to a point that Senator Nunn made, I think the starting point in this conversation with the Russians, with the Chinese, is, you know, what are the things that we know we could do but we haven't done because we understand the risk of escalation and things getting out of control? And can we take those off the table, at least absent a major direct conflict? So, for example, tampering with each other's nuclear command and control. Doing something to critical infrastructure that crosses the line to create actual deaths or civilian harm. And I'm not saying that by getting this agreement, we should then just say, okay, then we're done. We can assume that Russia and China will abide by it. But if you at least start to create certain things that you're trying to take off the table, then you can create an international consensus that if someone crosses that line, there will be a significant price. And the cost imposition piece becomes very clear and has to be factored in before someone crosses that line. And so it starts to reinforce deterrence of at least certain extreme, some of the most dangerous actions that we could imagine, but that no one's taken yet.
One of the precursors to all of this is I do think we need to have very well-defined norms in cyberspace, which we don't have today. And partially because of how this world grew up, which was with very anti-establishment and utopian principles. But today, and Eric Schmidt from Google talks about this, there's only one agreed upon norm in cyberspace, and that's that child pornography is wrong. Absent that, if you look across the world, there are places where IP theft is actually considered okay. There are places where committing cyber crime is a perfectly rational way to pull yourself out of poverty. So we have to figure out what the norms are going to be in order to establish that escalation policy and the deterrence policy. The second thing I would say is we have to make sure we're not living in a glass house. So right now, one could argue how resilient our infrastructure is, and whether we need to go through a massive transformation and upgrade of that infrastructure, because could it withstand? If we throw that first rock and someone throws a rock back, what happens to our infrastructure? So I think this is where developing a coherent national strategy becomes very important, and security is a pillar of that strategy, but it doesn't live in a vacuum. There's a lot of other pieces, including technology transformation, policy norms, et cetera, that have to be built into it.
So let's switch. Go ahead.
Can I talk about attribution a little bit? I think that the attribution difficulty issue is a nuanced one. Attribution, if the U.S. government decides I really want to know who did this cyber attack, then they're very successful at determining that because they apply a lot of tools that aren't available to victims or even to commercial companies in the space. Commercial companies have options that go beyond what most companies have, and so that's why those companies I mentioned earlier are pretty good at this, because they can apply those almost intelligence community-like capabilities to what they're doing. But the problem is of scale. So not every attack is going to have those level of resources put on it, and so as a nation, we need to understand when are we going to decide that when are we going to decide, or how are we going to decide which attacks are important enough to apply that level of resource to in order to get to that attribution? But I can't think of a single major breach where the U.S. government cared a lot about the answer that we could not determine what attribution was. It might not be fast. It's not instantaneous, that's for sure. It's not like we're at the event, tell me who it was. In fact, attribution that happens right now is almost always wrong. But it gets it right within days or at most a couple weeks.
I want to add to that. Agree with that 100%. There's actually two steps to the attribution, right? If you're going to take action. One is that you have some significant level of confidence that you know who did it. And I agree that we usually have that. But the second is to be able to go public with it, and you get into sources and methods issues, but more importantly, to go public with it in a way that it's actually convincing to the public that you know what you're talking about and that you've gotten the answer right if you're going to take significant action in order to deter. So all of those have to come together in that attribution space, and that gets very difficult.
Great. So let's transition from deterrence, and let's think about the role for offensive cyber attacks in protecting the U.S. defensively against attacks by others. So is an effective offense essential in order to provide deterrence and response?
I would say at least.
I'm going to ask that you please pass the microphone, because I think we're having difficulty with the sound system.
I would say that at least the threat of offensive cyber capability and an understanding that you have that threat and that there are certain criteria for its use is important to cyber defense. Because without it, you're missing a key tool. That said, and I think Michelle said this earlier, the correct response to a cyber attack is often not a cyber response. The correct response is some other element of national power against the nation state. And so there's a pretty fine-grained calculus that goes into determining that. But having offensive cyber capability in your toolkit is absolutely something that's essential to cyber defense.
I think one of the questions raised by the new cyber strategy is at what level do decisions get made for different kinds of actions? Because things that seem very tactical in nature in terms of disrupting or preventing an attack or the generation of an attack at its source can have second and third order effects that become quite strategic, and those have to be anticipated. So I think one of the things that's not clear in the unclassified version of this is what are the rules of engagement, and where are the authorities and permissions situated? What can a tactical operator at Cybercom decide, and what needs to go to a higher authority and what needs to go all the way to the president. I think on the issue of, then you get to how do you make sure that you're looking across the tools of government to decide what's the most effective combination of things to disrupt, defeat, or deter. And there, again, I think we don't have the mechanism right now to be doing that in real time on an interagency, whole of government basis. And when you think about someone like Vladimir Putin, what worries him most is, threats to his legitimacy and revelations of some of his illicit and otherwise unsavory behaviors to his broader population. He worries about the loyalty and continued support of the oligarchs around him, without whom his regime would not be possible. So if you really have to get inside understanding what does a particular leader value and what could potentially make him or her think twice about continuing with the kind of cyber attacks they've undertaken. And again, the answer may not be a cyber response. The answer may be something very different. And again, we need that larger mechanism to work through what those options are on a whole of government basis.
Maybe just two add-on thoughts. One is I am a big supporter of taking offensive cyber action to stop a cyber attack against us. If you get the rules of engagement right and you get the decision-making right, that makes a lot of sense to me. But you still need international agreement around that, right? Because as you all know, if the Russians are attacking us, that attack's not coming directly from Moscow to here. They're doing jump to jump to jump to jump. And where we might be attacking might be a server in Switzerland. So the Swiss better be on board if we're attacking that server to stop that attack from Russia. So all of that needs to be worked out and thought through. And let me just mention, just to follow on to Michelle's excellent points about Putin. She's exactly right at what matters to him. And what we've done so far, indicting specific Russian officials or sanctioning specific officials and entities in Russia, have absolutely no impact. Those institutions and those individuals wear those indictments and those sanctions as badges of honor. It does not deter in any way.
Well, that's a nice segue into a different topic. Let's talk about securing the global technology supply chain. So today, there was a Bloomberg article that reports that China used a tiny chip to infiltrate US this. And so China makes approximately 75% of the world's mobile phones and 90% of PCs. So according to this article, the Chinese military designed and manufactured microchips that were the size of a pencil tip. And they were inserted at Chinese factories that supplied Supermicro, which is a seller of web servers, of server motherboards. And so they sabotaged the servers, according to the report, that made their way into data centers around the world, in the United States. And when switched on, the microchip altered the operating system to allow code to allow code into the chip and into the computer and the server. So what role, given that article this morning, what role should the federal government play and private industry play in securing our global technology supply chain?
So I'll start with a private sector perspective on this. One of the issues we have, and where I think Russia has actually been brilliant, is democracies are really great at responding to direct, clear attacks, at destruction. We can recover. When you undermine our root of trust, we don't know how to exist. And that's what Russia is right now going after, is the root of trust in our democracy. It's very hard to recover from that. And a piece of this is trust between the private sector and the public sector in understanding what these third-party risks are. So if you go to the Valley, it's very difficult to convince folks that Chinese equipment, Chinese products and services, including some that are very public and that are being used by US companies, US agencies, et cetera, pose a real national security threat to us. So we have to figure out how to fix that bridge between the private sector and the public sector. And the leaks that Rick referenced did a lot to damage the credibility of the US government within the technology sector, especially with folks who don't have experience, don't hold clearances, don't actually understand what's going on. I actually met with the CEO of a very large financial services institution in the US who asked me, hey, is it really true that these, Huawei, ZTE, et cetera, represent a threat? And I kind of stared blankly, probably the way Director Deutsch did, going, are you kidding me? Of course they do. How can this not be understood by folks who should know better? So we have to figure out how to help the private sector understand the reality behind the security threats. This is a very direct one, but there's lots of Chinese companies out there. By the way, China is also investing heavily in US technology companies. In fact, they may be pretty close to being the #1 investor in US cybersecurity companies. And if you don't think there's a strategy behind that, then you don't understand how China works. Now, to go to the Valley and say, don't take Chinese money, don't buy cheap Chinese products, doesn't work. We have to create an alternative for them. So this is a difficult problem. There is no question that the supply chain risk is there. It's actually even worse than that. So if you want to sell your products into China, there's 300 regulations in China that require you to open your code base up to them, which allows them to inspect everything you're doing, whether for a whole bunch of reasons. They are dedicated from a national strategy perspective. So that's one of the issues we're going to have to turn into.
I was just going to say, my job when I was deputy director was to put the intelligence on the table in the sit room, so maybe I'll do that right now. There's 3 ways that an adversary can get into your network, right? One is virtually. The second is via supply chain operations of the kind we just heard about. And the third is by recruiting an insider inside your organization, right? Those are the 3 ways to get inside your network. As we get better at defending the virtual attack, the adversary will move in the other 2 directions. And I think there's a trend in supply chain attacks. I agree with Andy that it's not terribly significant today, but I think it's becoming more significant all the time. And I think it's a very significant risk. And the insider threat, we simply don't know, right? We simply don't know to what extent the Russians and the Chinese and other nations have actually recruited individuals to get inside the networks of different entities. Not a lot of evidence of that, but I wouldn't take the absence of evidence to mean the evidence of absence. So I think we got to pay attention much more to the other 2 as we do to the first.
And I think supply chain incidents like the one that was described, it was reported in the Bloomberg article, are hard to detect. It's hard to reverse engineer hardware at the chip level and figure out what it did. It's not impossible, but it just takes a while, and so the scaling is all wrong. Advantage attacker in this case. But supply chain goes way beyond chips. Think of supply chain as what's the janitorial service for your company, and who influences, who hires those people, and who does things, who can manipulate those people and get them to do things like steal documents or put devices in your building. What happens to your equipment after it's retired? When you upgrade your PCs and your servers, what happens to that equipment? So all those things, from the design of a system to who cleans the carpets in the office, is all part of supply chain. I think there's an underappreciation of that in the private sector. What can the private sector do, especially in the hardware case that we were just talking about? We need, and this is an innovation thing, and so private sector is way better at innovation than the government is. We need to be able to have trusted software run on untrusted hardware, and we need to have untrusted software run on trusted hardware. We need both those capabilities in order to operate in the kind of environment that we're going to need to. And I think from the point of view especially of the Defense Department, that's critically important as weapon systems become more and more connected.
If I could, I just wanted to foot stomp the human capital dimension of this, that, you know, I think this is already happening. One company that I've worked with did have an insider threat. The person was caught downloading information they shouldn't have had. And when they actually did the prosecution, this was a Chinese national, they found that prior to coming to work at this company, this person had systematically applied to every company and subcontractor working on a specific government program that they were trying to penetrate. So they literally knocked on every door over and over again until they finally got inside one. Fortunately, early on in their efforts, they were caught. But this kind of systematic effort is happening on the human side as well. And we shouldn't discount that just because we're not aware of it or reading about it every day in the paper.
And the implication of that for companies, right, is that if your HR people and your head of personnel security aren't lashed up with your network security people, you got a problem.
So I have a lot more questions that I can ask, but I do want to give the audience an opportunity. So I'm going to ask if anyone has a question, and I'm going to ask that if we can bring the mic to, is there someone to bring the mic to the individuals? How about if I ask another one while we're trying to figure out the mic situation? Peter, can you work on that? Okay, great. All right. So let's talk, as a computer scientist, I'm a technologist, and Andy's also a graduate of the same program that I am. So are there ways that technology changes your different approaches to preventing and responding to nation-state attacks? Can you tell us a little bit about that? What about machine learning and AI, for instance?
So I judge a lot of cybersecurity competitions, and in the past 2 years, I think there's about 3,000 companies saying they're doing AI to solve security. It's kind of the word du jour, and it's hard to understand exactly what they're referring to. There is no question that figuring out how to use machine learning and artificial intelligence to go through the massive amount of data to understand what's going on and to respond quickly there's huge promise in that. We're not there yet. There are vectors, security, orchestration and automation. The more you can take away from the security operators and automate, the faster your response time can be, and that's a very good thing. We've been using machine learning in cybersecurity for decades now. So all the anti-fraud products, for example, 25, 30 years old, use machine learning in order to help the financial services institutions identify where fraud is happening, especially on the consumer side. There's a lot of work being done on AI. The promise, it hasn't really matured yet, but as a buzzword, it is definitely out there. By the way, there's about somewhere between 2,500 and 12,000 cybersecurity companies, just to put things in context. It's kind of a hot mess when it comes to the market. The investors keep putting money in, and it makes it actually harder to separate the good from the bad and to identify the great products that are out there. So there's a lot of work to do. There's a lot of promise with high-performance computing, with AI, with ML, without question, but we're not there yet. By the way, all of that, like every piece of technology, there's good and bad to it, right? AI, ML in the hands of our adversary actually probably holds more short-term promise than in the hands of the defenders. So there is, and Andy talked about this, technology is a double-edged sword, there's no question about it. So much economic prosperity, so much growth, so much profitability. Our lives are better because of it, there's no question. And it can be used against us as well.
So I'm going to ask, if you have a question, that you please come over to the right here, and we have a microphone ready. If you can hold the mic up. And so I know we have a few questions from the audience. Please introduce yourselves when you before your question. Thank you.
Sure. Hi, my name is Nicole Dove. I'm with ADP. Earlier in the conversation today, we talked about defending forward and proactive prevention. Thinking about maybe one commonality between public and private sector is that we have people who have justifiable access to the data that we're trying to protect to do their day-to-day jobs. So I'm interested in understanding across the board, what are some of the strategies that you've seen, executed, or created to drive awareness as a part of that defending strategy?
I'm the one who used the phrase, so I think I don't have a detailed knowledge to answer your question. What I was noting is that this is a new concept showing up in a U.S. government strategy, and I think it opens a lot of questions about exactly how this would work, and that's not made clear in the document. So I'm not in a position to give you a good answer, but I don't know, based on your experience, Rick, whether you might have some ideas.
So General Paul Nakasone, who's the relatively new commander of Cyber Command and director of National Security Agency, describes that as persistent engagement. And at a high level, what he means is more like a soccer team than a football team, where you're engaged in offense and defense and flowing back and forth simultaneously with the fluidity, which is also an analogy that Mike Hayden used when he was a director. But it's not, the details beyond that get really sensitive really quickly. And so.
Hear me? It'll be on in a second. There we go. Hi, my name is Jack Anderson. I work at FTI Consulting, and I am also a master's student here at Tech. I generally work with energy companies in my job as a consultant, and within that, predominantly larger oil and gas companies. And of course, the state actor threat is of course on their mind. Something in my experience in recent years too is that a lot of these businesses have joint ventures, lines of business with state-owned enterprises overseas. And sometimes those state-owned enterprises get caught in the crossfire of state actors in cyberspace. And their partners from the US private sector also get caught in that crossfire. So I'm wondering if any of you have any thoughts on how bigger multinational enterprises should be defending and aware of the threats of maybe they might not get directly attacked, but when their business partners do, what should their response be to that, and how can they be resilient to it? Thank you.
From a cyber point of view, I think a couple of things to keep in mind, and I've seen this play out in the private sector with both Chinese and Russian joint ventures or engagements, is segment your network. Do not connect directly to the other guy's network, segment it and put a strong controls between there. The other thing that we're seeing is a lot of activity, nation-state activity directed against exploration companies' seismic data holdings, especially in the developing world, places like Africa, where they are looking to steal that information in order to advantage their, likely their state-owned enterprises. But it's definitely nation-state activity.
The one thing I would add is it's not just oil and gas. So this risk, if you look at FedEx and how they took the hit, FedEx was hit through a foreign subsidiary, basically, and that's, and their systems weren't upgraded, they weren't patched, et cetera. So whether it's oil and gas or any time a U.S. company, which is subject to, I think, 27,000 pieces of regulation, does a joint venture or buys a company overseas, there's inherent risk to that. So segmenting networks and isolating is obviously an important thing to do, but it's a risk.
That applies to M&A too.
Yes.
Any M&A. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Jeff Jones. Thank you so much. I've gotten so much out of the discussion today. I have a defense forward question as well. Hopefully I can get a little more information out of you than you've been releasing previously. My question is going to be more of what do you think instead of, what is your opinion, what's your theory on how this is going to work instead of how does it work? So in defense forward, do you think that, this is a two-pronged question, do you think that there will be deterrence that's generated from this just by having it there? Or do you think that it's going to have some actual action and teeth behind it, and then that will deter it? And then the second part of the question is, if you could go back and implement this historically, what types of attacks might this have prevented? Because I'm trying to get my head around just exactly how this would work. And I'm thinking of like NotPetya and some of the other recent cyber attacks that maybe not have directly involved the United States, but we knew that it would impact us, and it was out there. Could we have done something about it with this? Thank you.
I'll start at the kind of conceptual level and then leave the technical piece to others. I think I agree with Mike that we do have to defend forward in terms of if we are actually seeing the planning and you know, the progress of an attack, we have to try to get in there and prevent it, stop it, make it harder, thwart it. But I don't think that is going to be, I think it's necessary but not sufficient for deterrence. Because, you know, we're going to make it a lot, it's good if we can make it harder, if we can make it more frustrating, make it more difficult, but that alone is not going to keep someone from trying and doing better in the future. I think deterrence takes a much broader range of actions as we've described.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the cost benefit is all out of whack. Here's the benefit, here's the cost. And so you have to bring the benefit down and raise the cost. And that's what Michelle was talking about earlier with what motivates Putin and what are the levers that you would pull in order to affect his behavior. So I think that's absolutely right. And that's not just cyber, that's everything. It's economic sanctions, it's maybe covert action, it's all kinds of things involved in that space. I think that NotPetya is maybe not a good example because that was actually, you know, the Russian military intelligence, a direct attack against the Ukrainian government. They just didn't have good controls on the vector. And so the companies that were hit, Maersk and Merck and FedEx and Mondelez and a host of others, I think the White House characterized it as $10 billion worth of damage worldwide. They were just in the splash zone. The attack vector happened to be in their network too. They weren't intentional targets. And so from a private sector point of view, that's kind of scary. But you know, that was again, a known patched vulnerability. And if I can go back to something Nilu said earlier about companies can't be expected to defend themselves against nation state attacks, I think that's true. But I think they have to get to a basic level of cyber hygiene first. 95, 98, some number like that, % of attacks, successful exploitations of networks in the United States are on known vulnerabilities for which there exists a software patch, they just weren't patched. It's the analogy I like to use is that you have a bank where the bank stores the money in clear plastic bags on the curb outside the building, and then when it's robbed, we're surprised and we expect the police to fix that. Police need to get involved in bank robberies, but there's a certain level of hygiene that has to happen first.
By the way, I completely agree with that. I mean, if you look at NotPetya, the lesson is if a vendor comes out, says, we're not supporting this system, stop using it. Okay, since you're not stopping using it, we're going to put out a patch. DHS comes out and says, please, please patch your systems. It's not safe. And then shockingly, 3 months later, you're hacked. I mean, that's on you. That doesn't go to the statement I was trying to make. The one thing I would say is, I agree with you. I think there needs to be a level of cyber hygiene. The problem with nation-state attacks is, of course, they're using the easiest vectors right now. I mean, we look at the phishing attacks on the DNC. The exact same method was used 10 years earlier to go after Obama and McCain's campaigns. I mean, it's such an easy vector, and it continues to be exploited until we lock down the human and stop them from clicking on bad things. By the way, phishing has a 4% click rate, and for anyone who's in marketing, like that's a dream to get a 4% click rate. So I do agree with you, and I would still say at the end of the day, if a nation state's determined to do something to you, they'll find a more sophisticated way to get in.
So was there an attack that would have been prevented that you can think of if this had been around in the past? I probably used a bad example. I'm sure I did, but can you think of one that this would have stopped?
I don't know how to game that out to say, you know, the hypothetical situation and or that would have changed the motivation of the attacker. So I'm sorry, that's an unsatisfying answer, but.
So I'll give you an answer, and it's a guess. I think if the West had done a better job of deterring Moscow's attacks against the elections of its neighbors and elections in Western Europe, we would not have seen the attack against our election.
Hi, my name is Stephen Ike. I'm a PhD student here at Georgia Tech. First, thank you so much for coming and talking. This is truly an amazing opportunity for, I think, many people here. So, Mr. Morell, you talked a little bit about how the CIA has been putting information on paper. And then, Mr. Leggett, you talked about how one of the problems with, well, our networks have been designed to be highly, I think you mentioned the word availability. So I think all of this kind of ties into how we are losing trust in our computing systems, which has been, the word came up many times while you were up there. I come at it from a computer engineering and computer science standpoint. How do you, when you think of attacks that have happened, what do you see are the components within our computing systems which enable these attacks? Could it be that it's easy to copy anything, that it costs nothing to make a copy of something, that we don't have provenance of our information, that we don't know its history? Is there anything you can think of so that people in academia and industry can start to design these systems so that we don't have to, we can structurally defend against these attacks? Thank you.
I'm going to pitch this to my technical experts at the end.
I think I would say trust. Systems that trust other systems is the biggest fundamental problem, and systems that trust when another system says this person's been identified and authenticated through a logon ID and password or something like that, then I think that's at a fundamental level is a key problem. I don't know, Nilu, you have?
Well, security has been an afterthought, and actually I don't think security is its own thing, and I'm going to keep saying that. I think it's part of everything you do. So building products that are secure by design, we're just starting to think about that. And by the way, this came up earlier, it is not a user experience trade-off anymore to design a product to be secure by design. And there's some great companies out there that are putting out secure Wi-Fi routers, et cetera, and they are spectacular. I was working with one of them, and my 10-year-old daughter, it took her 3 minutes to install it and get it up and running, and unfortunately she set the password to a musical, but this is starting to happen. So we can't think about, hey, let's build a great product and then, oh, how do we bolt on the security after the fact? We just have to start understanding that as you build products, as you provide services, how you delight your customers, and this is a private sector hat, is by making them secure by design. That's how you protect your customers, and it's going to become a differentiating factor going forward for companies.
So besides learning that Nilu's Wi-Fi password is frozen, just a guess, but Hamilton, oh, okay. Hopefully changed by now. When the comment came up earlier about where do you go for help in document, training and assistance, documentation on building secure software, Software Engineering Institute at Carnegie Mellon is a federally funded research and development center. That's their job, is helping the Department of Defense and other parts of the government do that, and they actually publish a fair amount of stuff on secure software design. So if you SEI is the abbreviation.
I am not a technologist, but I'm going to take a risk and add to this point. I think on the hardware, the supply chain issue of chips and hardware, I think one challenge for all of you is figuring out how do we detect in a way that's not incredibly expensive and difficult. How do we detect tampering or embeds or things that when something that we've defined the specification, it's manufactured in China or India or wherever it is, and comes back to us, how do we know that something else hasn't been added there? I think that's going to be a huge set of challenges that need to be solved as well.
So I'm going to go way out there. I'm not a technologist at all, but I'm going to go way out there. I think imagination is really important. The 9/11 Commission said 9/11 was a failure of imagination, in the sense that we saw the strategic threat from Al-Qaeda to the United States, but we simply couldn't imagine that they would take over aircraft and use those aircraft as weapons themselves, right? Failure of imagination. I think there was a similar failure of imagination with regard to the Russian interference in our election, the weaponization of social media. If you go back and look at all of the worldwide threat testimonies of the Director of National Intelligence for the last 10 years, they talk about the threat of cyber, but nobody ever talked about the weaponization of social media. Another failure of imagination. So I think it's incumbent upon security people and people responsible for protecting organizations that they imagine the possibilities and then protect against those. It's really important.
So Michael, since you mentioned elections, what policy do you recommend for securing our elections in particular?
So, I'm a big believer in doing what we can to defend ourselves. And there's been some work done to harden the election systems in the states, but in my view, not enough. I think there are 5 states, in fact, I'm not going to mention them, but I think there are 5 states that are very vulnerable. And if I were the Russians, I would just go mess around in those 5 states and create the impression that I've done something just to create chaos without actually ever having to have any success. So you have to do whatever you can to defend yourselves. And then you have to do that first piece we talked about, which is deter, which we have absolutely not done.
And I don't think the Russians put a huge amount of strategic import on the midterms, but they will use it as a testing bed. And if we're smart, we'll be watching carefully to see what they play around with, that in terms of going beyond what they did last time. We know they were inside networks last time, that they didn't actually take action on the basis of that access. I think we need to really go to school on what we see in this next round and really use the next 2 years to try to give ourselves better defense, but also take some measures that may be outside the domain, cyber domain, to give us confidence that no matter what happens, we will know what our election results are. And like the CIA example, maybe that you want your audit trail to be back to a paper system.
When it comes to elections, there's 3 pieces of it from my perspective. One is the actual voting machine and hardening that voting machine and making sure there's an audit trail. I actually think that's pretty doable. These machines, for the most part, are air-gapped. There's something like 175,000 precincts, and it's going to take a massive effort to actually do something that has widespread impact. So I'm less worried about the voting machines. Then there's the election infrastructure, right? The websites that tell you where to go to, what the requirements are in order to be vote. Those can be messed with pretty easily. So imagine if the website suddenly gets changed that you need to bring 34 pieces of identification in order to register to vote or to cast your vote, or they send you to the wrong location. That's a problem. The third piece of it is the influence campaign, and it goes back to the root of trust. And that's the piece that I think we have, as a democracy, a very, very difficult time addressing. And it's not just fake news, right? It's the weaponization of even information. If you think about the DNC hack, those emails were the actual emails that were released, right? It wasn't fake news, but that information was weaponized and used to sow distrust and create chaos. So addressing that is the part where, and this is why it's great to be out of DC, it's not about being conservative, liberal, it's not about being Republican, Democrat, it's about being Americans first and figuring out how to rise above that fray and come together as a country and say, this isn't okay, we're not going to allow this to happen, and what are the policies and actions we're going to take to prevent nation states from influencing not only our elections, by the way, but again, all the other elections around the world. And when you talk about failure of imagination, I mean, South Korea was doing this, North Korea was doing this a long time ago. I mean, they have actually tried a lot of the techniques that now Russia is using long before Russia used it against us. So we need to have that imagination to understand as new vectors start coming out, how could they be used against us, and how are we going to protect our democracy?
I just wanted to say that in all of the areas that we've talked about with regard to elections, there are very good ideas of things we need to do. There's bipartisan legislation in a number of areas that has simply not moved anywhere because this thing is so political. So I don't think we're going to get to where we need to be until, as you said, we rise above that.
We have time for one more question.
Joke's on you, I have two.
Pick one. Thank you.
Curtis Weibin, I'm a master's student here at Georgia Tech, but also full-time job. I'm in the Navy. I'm actually with Fleet Cyber Command, so Deputy Director. It's good to see you again. So I actually asked this question of Admiral Rogers, I think 3 years ago, and I'm interested to see what has changed in that time period. But the Senator brought up this exact point earlier, and that is, do you foresee a time period or in the future a point where we would have, probably from Cybercom, a cyber operation with the full faith stamp of approval acknowledged, brought to you courtesy of United States Cybercom? There's obviously a lot of considerations that go with that. Admiral Rogers kind of didn't have much of an answer 3 years ago, but he did say it was on his plate. So I'm interested to see how that's changed with the opinion of the panels.
Yes, I think it will, and I mean, part of deterrence is making people know that you've done things. So absolutely, Cyber Command will conduct a cyber operation. It'll be public. It'll be attributed. They'll say, yeah, this was us.
I do want to just draw a distinction that I think that I agree. There will be operations in the future where we publicly own it, announce it, and that's an important part of deterrence. But there are times when you don't need to publicly announce. You just need to make sure your target knows where it's come from. So, because you're trying to affect an individual or a small group's calculus. And it doesn't necessarily have to be blasted across the airwaves. It just, they have to know exactly who's done this and that you can hold them at risk. And that needs to be part of their cost calculation.
And you can argue that's actually already been done. I think it was Bob Work who said something about, we're dropping cyber bombs on ISIS. So there you go, public acknowledgement of a campaign directed against somebody. He didn't give technical details, nor should he, but and I do have a little bit of problem with cyber bombs. That's not a good analogy.
Well, I want to ask you all to join me in thanking our amazing panel this morning.